So the next set, this is a pretty important set of these notes, and we're almost there, are the revolutions of 1848. You gotta know them. The good part of these revolutions, so we're going to talk about the revolutions in France, which we kind of just did, in Austria, in the German states, and in Italy, is they all kind of follow the same process. So kind of when you understand one, you'll understand them all. And again, we're looking at this from the bigger picture, generally speaking. So when I look at the revolutions of 1848, the first word that is popping into my brain is nationalism. Nationalism, nationalism, nationalism. So there's going to be different forms of nationalism. It depends on which country we're talking about. But it's all connected to romantic nationalism. So our context. In 1848, we have many revolutions in Europe that take place in literally every country, except for Britain, Russia, and Sweden. We don't talk about Sweden whatsoever. So I want to first talk about why they don't occur in Britain and Russia. First, Britain. In Britain, the British just kind of know when that like metaphorical pot of boiling water or heating up water, where the pot is going to boil over and like spit off the top, aka revolution. The British know when to like turn down the heat. So when they see people calling for, I don't know, like more voting rights, they're going to pass a reform bill like in 1832 to enlarge the franchise. So basically the British just know when to pass parliamentary reform to quell animosity in their country. The Russians are going to take a different approach. They're just going to crush all forms of nationalism and liberalism. They're going to maintain this idea of the concert system, the Metternich system, to crush liberalism with violent results. And then Sweden, well, Sweden's just Sweden. Okay. So additionally, our other context, as I already mentioned it multiple times, is there's an economic downturn throughout Europe in the 1840s. There's basically a depression in the 1840s, unemployment, business are failing, plus the hungry 40s, hunger and famine. This is just ripe for a series of revolutions. And they're first going to start in France and then follow through. So Metternich, who's still in power, not much longer, famously says, when France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches cold. So it begins in Paris, and then these revolutions occur throughout Europe for the most part. So what do all of these revolutionaries have in common? So regardless of the country, they want a constitutional government. So they're usually rebelling against an autocratic government. They want liberal reforms, especially for the middle class. They would love independence, so if you're the Hungarians revolting against the Austrians, they want their own country. So these national groups, ethnic groups, want their own country, aka nationalism. And yes, forms of feudalism still exist in Europe. There is still serfdom in Europe, okay? So especially in the German states, obviously in Russia, although Russia's not going to experience a revolution because they will just pull a Hulk and smash. So additionally, these revolutions all fail. Literally all of them fail. Mr. Brogash, I thought the one in France actually succeeded. Well, yeah, did it though? They're going to eventually get an emperor in 1852, 4 years after the revolutions. So that's why we say all of these revolutions fail, or at least misfire. That one's actually referencing France, where it looks like it's successful, but they're just going to get an emperor out of this in 1852. All right, skip over this. Okay, so the nice part of these revolutions is they follow these stages. Regardless of country, you can usually use these generalizations. So first, worker students are pressured to attack the regime. So basically, they're upset about the unemployment, they're upset by the hunger crisis, they're upset by their lack of franchise. So largely, we see the middle class starting these movements, and it's usually going to trickle into the working class as well. And they sometimes force actual political change. So sometimes they do get something, some type of concession out of the government, and it's looking really great. But then, because these revolutionaries are fairly diverse, the working class has very different views on what needs to be done than the wealthy middle class, they start fighting each other. Or there's fighting between different ethnic groups, especially in Austria. Once they're fighting themselves, they're effectively divided, and then that established regime is able to consolidate power once again, usually by calling in the troops and shooting. So, this generalization works in the 4 countries we're going to cover. France, the Austrian Empire, the Frankfurt Assembly in the German states, and the Italian states. Again, remember, there is no country called Germany yet. There is no country called Italy yet. All right, so most of this is review, but there's a little bit more depth that we'll cover with the Revolution of 1848 in France. And this revolution is called the February Revolution. I wonder why they call it the February Revolution. Yes, it happened in February, geez. So we know a good portion of the country is upset with the Citizen King, or maybe not the Citizen King anymore, he's Laplace. So the straw that breaks the camel's back with Louis Philippe's kingdom in France is historically during his reign, they allowed these like yearly gatherings, political gatherings called banquets. And basically a banquet's for the middle class where they can like tell the government to change X, Y, and Z. And usually the government says, all right, we got your back, and they usually don't do much. But nonetheless, it was a form of allowing people to like assemble and protest things they don't like. Louis Philippe outright banned the great banquets. And this is what led the middle class and in the working class to, yes, rapidly erect the barricades and the streets. Louis Philippe calls in the troops. When he calls in the troops, he tells them to march, and they didn't march. Folks, when you tell the military to shoot and they don't shoot, you are no longer king. So Louis Philippe resigned, fled the country. So, again, it sounds like it's going to be stinking successful, but we'll talk about how it won't be very, very shortly here. So, whenever there's a revolution that is, well, at least in the short term, successful, the next type of government is usually called this, a provisional government, provisional meaning temporary. And look what France gets. They get the Second French Republic. There is no monarchy in the Second French Republic because of the name. So remember, the First French Republic was the National Convention during the French Revolution of starting in 1789. The French National Convention begins in September 1792. And look at what they do. They abolish the slavery again because the National Convention already did it, but then it was brought back by Napoleon and the subsequent monarchs after that. And Louis Blanc becomes super popular in the Second French Republic because he established those national workshops which found jobs for the unemployed, and if they couldn't even get a job, they were actually given a small ration of money by the government. Not necessarily universal income per se, but maybe an early version of it in the 19th century at least. They established universal male suffrage. All men can vote regardless of wealth, property, if they were renting an apartment, renting a flat, or owning land, did not matter, universal male suffrage. So, what starts happening is, once again, people are getting upset with the government. There is still starvation. They're not dealing with these crises. So now there are rioters in the streets, once again, barricading the streets. Now they're sending in the troops to crush this rebellion, making this government more and more unpopular. So, because people are rebelling, the government is now taking a turn back to conservatism. They're repealing some of these famous liberal reforms, believing that, once you give a mouse a cookie, they're going to ask for more. Here's an actual photograph of these barricaded streets, which I think is super cool. So a popular form of photography was invented in 1837. It's called the French daguerreotype. And this is actually an early daguerreotype. So you see how there are multiple levels of these barricaded streets. And also, this is before Paris is rebuilt to widen the streets in Paris to actually make them more difficult to barricade. So Paris is still a medieval city at this point. So it was actually fairly easy to barricade a French street, or a Parisian street. Okay, so something's got to change. Remember, provisional governments are temporary for a reason. So they actually had a presidential election. So because, again, they're a republic, they're not going to have a monarch, but they are going to have a president, also usually a prime minister. So on the ballot for president were about four names, and one of which is actually the general who crushed the June days, just on one of the previous slides. And then there was another name on there. His name was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, the nephew of the Napoleon. So remember, this is literally the first election in French history that's actually universal male suffrage. That is truly universal. So many of these men cannot read. They're not able to look into the background of the candidates, seeing what their platforms are, becoming informed voters. So when they go to the polls, they vote, by and large, for the underdog, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Why do you think they voted for him? Because of the last name. Well, I guess the first and the last name. The middle and the first name, last name here. They voted by the association to the Napoleon. Because, remember the context, they're in the process of rebellions, riots in Paris. It's unstable. When you think of the word Napoleon Bonaparte, the first word that comes into my mind is stability, strong leadership, stuff like that. So they vote for Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. And he becomes president of the Second French Republic. So, who is this guy? Well, again, I told you he's nephew of Napoleon. And he did, in fact, try to lead two pretty pathetic attempts to overthrow the government beforehand. And a lot of people just made fun of him because he actually grew up in the German states. So he actually spoke German better than French. So his French had honestly a horrific German accent to it. But nonetheless, he gets voted into power because of his association with the Napoleon. So what's going to happen here is this Napoleon is going to restrict the rights of these voters. So he was just voted in by universal suffrage. And look at this. He's going to change the residency requirements of the right to vote to purposely exclude the working class men from voting. And generally speaking, the working class men were more leftist, more liberal when it came to who they voted for. So we're seeing a process of him kind of now restricting these rights in France, and eventually he's going to declare himself emperor by overthrowing himself, interesting enough. So additionally, we'll talk a little bit about this once we get to the revolution in Italy in 1848, but the Pope was removed from power in 1848, and we know France is like 90% Catholic, so he sends in French troops to reinstall the Pope in control of the Vatican. And the French troops will be in Rome, protecting the Pope from 1848 until 1870. So it's continual French presence in Rome until 1870. So, check this out. When he's president, he just extended his presidential term, saying, it's kind of chaotic right now, we need to keep my presidency here. So he extends his own presidential term. And then, again, he held, in his uncle's style, held a plebiscite after the fact, and he got overwhelming support to keep his presidency. Then, the following year, he literally overthrew himself and declares himself not president, but Emperor Napoleon III. So that's where I'm actually going to stop with Napoleon here, Napoleon III. He's going to be more appropriate to talk about this stuff in the second set of notes, which is 1850 to 1914. So I'll hold off for there and just skip through that slide. All right, so now let's look at the Revolution 1848 in the Austrian Empire. So in this case, we know Austria is getting larger and larger since after the 30 Years' War. And we already know these generalizations. The Austrian Empire is ethnically diverse. There are tons of different ethnic groups in it, like Magyars, which are Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Poles, Ruthenians, Slovaks, and other persuasions of Slavs. So, generally speaking, when you have these ethnic groups, they usually want either more autonomy, self-rule, or they want flat-out independence. They are all nationalistic groups, right? So, Metternich is still in power in 1848. He's been there for 30 years, being the chief minister to whoever the Emperor of Austria was. And we know Metternich's deal by now. Crush liberalism, crush nationalism. But this will be his last year in power because of this beautifully bearded and mustachioed man, Louis Kossuth. So let's talk about Louis Kossuth. First, if you're listening to this in New Hartford, New York, you should be familiar with a street in East Utica called Kossuth Ave, with the former famous fish market there on that street. Why? Because there was a decent amount of Hungarian immigration to Utica, and they named a street after their nationalist leader from 1848, Louis Kossuth. So we have Magyar nationalist. So Louis Kossuth gives a speech to the Hungarian Diet calling for autonomy, possibly independence of Hungarians. And then there is riots in the capital city of the Austrian Empire in Vienna. They even invaded the royal palace. Metternich resigned and then fled the country to England. The emperor also fled. Like, this is happening in a split second here. Once the emperor and Metternich are gone, Hungary and Bohemia declare themselves effectively independent, or at least constitutionally separate, but effectively independent. And they're going to call for much more autonomy. Then the northern parts of the Italian states also proclaimed independence from the Austrian Empire. So again, does it look like this revolution is going to be successful? Yes, it does. But then we see the issues take place. Now, there's going to be disagreements among the revolutionaries. Same old story. So what happens are the Hungarian nationalists, the Magyar nationalism, is now like controlling these constitutionally separate areas at the expense of the non-Magyar ethnic populations. Basically, they're doing the same thing that the Austrians did to the Hungarians. So there's now a civil war in Hungary. Once again, when they're divided, they can be able to be taken advantage of. So now Austria sees its opening. So the new Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, who, fun fact, is the third longest ruling monarch in European history, is going to call in the troops, but he's also going to ask for help. He's going to bring in the policeman of Europe's troops, Tsar Nicholas I, the instrument of the Metternich system, to crush these revolutions in the Austrian Empire. And yes, they are successful. So this revolution in the Austrian Empire is not successful. Conservatism remains in Austria for now. All right. Third of four revolutions here. So Frankfurt Assembly. Where is Frankfurt? Well, Frankfurt is in the German states. Remember, Germany does not exist, so please say the German states. It's a more accurate representation. So the Frankfurt Assembly is basically this group of largely liberals, many students, and just middle class largely in general. And their goal is to make a unified Germany, actually make a country called Germany. And they wanted a constitution that was fairly liberal, that was not autocratic, was not solely under the control of one monarch. So it is just the middle class. So who is not represented? Obviously the working class. Also, not the nobility. And we know that in the German states, the German nobility has significant power. So that's already a shot at the legitimacy of this assembly. It did not include the nobility. So, they have issues. First of all, what is Germany? Like, what do you include with Germany? Well, in Austria, the ethnic majority are German Austrian. So do you include Austria? I don't think so. Bohemia, there's a bunch of Germans there. Bunch of Germans in Switzerland. Bunch of Germans in Schleswig and Holstein, which is effectively Danish. And then what about the non-German nationals in these areas that are dominated by Germans? Like, what would you do with them? Do you create an ethnically homogenous country by kicking them out, or do you include them? So, once again, there are revolts in Frankfurt, and the Prussian army is sent in to control it. So, the Frankfurt Assembly wrote this constitution, and it called for a constitutional monarchy led by the Prussian king, who at this point was Frederick William IV, or Friedrich Wilhelm IV, Jesse Hohenzollern. And this guy famously responded with, "I will not pick up the crown from the gutter." He rejected this crown to be a constitutional monarch. He did it for two reasons. One, he would have had to be a constitutional monarch, a limited monarch. Doesn't want that. Two, who was not included in the Frankfurt Assembly? The nobility, especially the Prussian nobility, the Junkers. And we know the Junkers have incredible amounts of power in Prussia in particular. So if the German princes offered him the crown, he may have said yes. But the fact is the middle class is offering him the crown. He did not view it as legitimate. He did not want to be a constitutional monarch. He rejected it. So, now the revolution in the German states failed. What about Italy? Let's see, Italy. Come on, you can do it. Okay, they won't. So, once again, there are revolutions in Italy, and they actually overthrew the Pope. So the Pope at this point is Pope Pius IX. They overthrow him, and two nationalist leaders become the leaders of the government, Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi. They look like they've effectively taken over a good portion of the country. Well, that was until, remember, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, at this point the French president, sends in French troops to reinstall the Pope, effectively destroying the attempts to unify Italy as one country. So Italy will not be unified until a couple decades after this. So once again, failed. All right, so this set of notes about Napoleon III, again, I'm going to leave off until the second part of the 19th century notes because it makes more timeline and chronological sense. So I'm going to skip through this. And I don't think there's anything else. All right. Folks, that is it. Thank you for bearing with me on this two-part series on the notes from the first half of the 19th century. So like when I'm reviewing this in my brain right now, I always like to characterize the first 50 years of the 19th century as the domination of conservative Europe, the Congress of Vienna creating the concert system, the Metternich system, to crush nationalism, crush liberalism. Was there plenty of resistance of nationalism and liberalism against the conservative order? Yes. Did it work? Largely no, with some exceptions. So make sure you have a firm understanding of the conservative order from the first half of the 19th century. So thank you so much for listening. Have a good one.